this is the fourth time we've done it. I'm very involved with Brandeis National Committee, and we offer a lot of wonderful study groups in our Sarasota chapter, and one of them is called Fascinating Women. And Sonia was one of the first because she has had a fascinating life, and I got to interview her. And then the second year, I was one of the fascinating women, and she interviewed me. But her life is very interesting. Oh, before I start talking about Sonia, I just want to thank your synagogue for offering such tremendous programming. I've enjoyed the Jewish Dems programs that you have presented. I think I've been at almost every one. And this is wonderful to do this before services. Okay, so I think that it makes most sense to talk about Sonia's life chronologically. What happened to her as a young child, you will see, impacted her life in various ways. So Sonia, let's start at the very beginning. Talk just a very little bit about your parents' early lives in Poland, how they met and married, and their very early married life a little bit.
Okay, Barb. Well, my parents were both born in a shtetl in Poland called, the official name was Pilica, but the Jews called it Pilz. And it had a sizable Jewish population. They were both born there. My mother lost her mother when my mother was 10 years old, and her father remarried shortly thereafter to a woman who had a daughter of her own also. There's really so much to tell about my parents, Barbara. I don't know where to go. I'll go a little bit to my father. I know absolutely nothing about my father's father. His name intrigued me because it would have been Pressman, which is more German sounding than Polish, but I don't know anything about him. I know that my paternal grandmother had 3 husbands, and my father's father was one of them, but other than that, I know nothing about her. And my paternal grandmother, named Udel Ulmer, had a bakery. And my father, as a youngster, worked for a tailor, and he used to deliver clothes for that tailor. My father never went in his entire life to any school and was illiterate. He was a terrific businessman, but had absolutely no education. My mother had a little bit of education because she had uncles who were teachers. My mother's father was, there are words for it, and I don't know whether they're Yiddish or Polish. He was called a Marshalik or a Batchen. And what he did was go to weddings, and I don't know if they had mitzvahs then, and he would tell stories and jokes, and that's what he did for a living. So you can imagine what a meager living he made.
Tell about how your parents met.
So when my mother's father remarried, my mother's stepmother was not crazy about her. And one time, my mother's father came home, and the stepmother complained about my mother to him, that my mother was studying her Hebrew. I didn't think girls studied Hebrew in those days, but this is the story I got from my mother, that her stepmother complained to her father that she was studying her Hebrew out loud, and it was giving the stepmother a headache. So my maternal grandfather took my mother by the hair and threw her across the room. So she went outside and sat on a stoop and was crying. And her mother had a well-to-do brother, my mother's uncle, who lived in Warsaw with his wife and 2 children, a daughter named Helcha and a son named Dalek. And the uncle was coming to visit. And he saw my mother crying on the stoop. And he asked her why she was crying, and she told him what had happened. He said he would take her to live with him in Warsaw with his family. And that's what happened. She left Pilz and went to Warsaw and lived with that uncle and his family, and was a sort of combination poor relative and housekeeper.
And how did she get back to meet your dad?
So then, when my mother was perhaps 20, she went back to Pilz to visit her father. And by that time, my father was working. My father had crossed the border to Germany when he was 14. He ran across the border illegally and went to Germany and got a job in some kind of a tailor shop. But when he was about 18, 19, he went back to Pilz to visit his mother. Now, I should say that when my father ran across the border guards shot at him, and they shot his hat and put a hole through it. And they brought his hat back to his mother and told his mother that he'd been killed illegally crossing the border. So his mother thought he was dead. And since he couldn't read or write, he didn't communicate with his mother. So he decided to visit his mother and went to Pilz and knocked on her door, and she opened it. And when she saw him, she said, "Ghost, go back to your grave." So he had to explain to her that he was alive and had come to visit her and all of that.
And
So-
your mom was still living there at the time, or no, she was in Germany?
Same time, my mother was there visiting her father.
Right.
And a matchmaker, who I think was a cousin of my mother's, introduced the two of them and to make a match. And they took a short walk, and my father gave my mother his picture. She looked at it and said, "It's a nice picture." And we wanted to return it to him, and he said to her, "No, you can keep it." So she said to herself, "Oh, this guy must really like me." And after that short walk, he went back to Germany, and she went back to Warsaw. But in Germany at that time, they used to have these romantic picture postcards. On the front was a woman and a man in some kind of romantic pose. And on the back, you could write a note. So my father got friends of his to write on those postcards to my mother. Of course, she thought it was my father writing. She had had a little education. She had uncles who were teachers, and she had a little elementary school education. So she got these postcards for a while, and then my father wrote one where he called her darling. And she wrote back and said, "You can't call me darling, it's not appropriate." And he wrote back and said, "It's all right for me to call you darling because you're going to be my wife."
Okay. So then they got married and had your brother. And where did they live?
I don't know all the places they lived. When my brother was born, they were living in Frankfurt am Main. I don't know if they lived in other places too. When I was born, they were living in Berlin.
Right. And talk about when you were born, because that's my favorite story.
Well, after my parents had my brother, who was born about a year after their marriage, my mother had 7 abortions and an ectopic pregnancy. And it took her a year to recover from that ectopic pregnancy. And she was told by her doctor, because of that she must never get pregnant again. So after that, she became pregnant with me. And she had 2 abortionists, and she went to the one she preferred. But he was having an affair with a ballerina and had taken her to the Swiss Alps for the weekend. So my mother couldn't have the abortion. She went home, went to bed. My father came home from work, saw her in bed. He said, Lena, you had it done? She said, no, Dr. So-and-so is in the Swiss Alps. I'll have to go Monday to Dr. Levy Lenz, which was her other abortionist. And I happened to have found out his name. And my father said, let it be already. So that's why I was born.
You see why that's my favorite story.
One of my favorites too. Yeah,
Yeah.
I always love it because when people hear that story, they say to me, your mother told you that story? And they always say, how did it feel to be such an unwanted child? And my answer is, I never in my life asked my parents for anything that I didn't get.
You were always wanted. But in 1933, everything changed. Now, your brother Herman is 14 years older than you, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so in 1933, you are 5. And what happens?
Well, Herman was 19 at that time. And on January 30th, 1933, Hitler was named Vice Chancellor of Germany by the President of Germany, von Hindenburg. And my brother had started keeping a diary in German shorthand in 1932. It has now been translated, he and his granddaughter translated it into English. It's in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I have a copy, it's online. So I am very familiar with that diary. And as soon as Hitler was named Vice Chancellor, my brother saw the threat to the Jews. And my father at that time was the prosperous owner of a men's clothing store in Berlin. And my mother and my brother helped out in that store. My brother was going to a high school to learn more about fabrics for my brother's use in the store. So my brother went to my father and said, we have to leave here. Well, my father thought it was ridiculous. He had recently bought a building with 4 stores and 40 apartments as an investment property. They had a home, they had this store, they had maids in the house, they were well-to-do by this time. And my father said that Hitler and his thugs will blow over and everything will be as it was before. He wouldn't hear of it. So then there were several incidents involving Jewish people that my brother saw. One involved him, others involved people we knew. And then a group of thugs came into our men's clothing store, some of whom had worked for us. And they came in to rob the store. And my brother ran to his office and he called the police. And the police came and chased out those thugs. But they said to my father, hey, Pressman, if anything like this happens again, don't call us. We won't come, you are you. So I think that was the final straw for my brother. And he said, if my parents aren't going to leave, he will go by himself. He wanted initially to go to England, but he couldn't get a visa. So he was able to get a 3-day visa to go to Belgium. And we had some cousins in Antwerp. So my brother left by himself and went to Antwerp.
And then what happened with your parents? What did they do at that point?
Well, we had some cousins named Mendelssohn in Antwerp, and my brother went to live with them, but he didn't have any legal papers to allow him to remain in Belgium. So he was running around trying to get the right to remain in Belgium. My parents, meanwhile, wrote to my brother and said things are getting better in Germany and they would like him to return and they need his help in the store. So my brother was a very good son and he wrote back and said that if my parents order him to return, he will return, but he doesn't want to because he read in the papers that Jews who have left Berlin, if they return, the Nazis are waiting for them at the railroad station and they never heard from again. But my brother said if they order him to return, he'll return. So my mother wrote and said, we order you to return. And he was going to return. And then I'm sorry that I never asked my father this question, but my father changed his mind. And he decided to leave Germany. And he told me that he sat down in a small room with 3 or 4 Nazis, and he gave them our apartment, our business, and the investment property he had recently bought, and they gave him a fraction of their value, and they said we could go.
So now the family is together in Antwerp.
Correct. And this is about the middle of 1933.
Right. And then what went on in Antwerp?
Well, in Antwerp, my brother was running around trying, none of us in the family had the right to, legally, the right to remain in Belgium. So my brother was running around like crazy, trying to get permission to remain in Belgium. My father was meanwhile going all over Europe and was thinking about going to Palestine and was trying to find a way to make a living. And nothing was working out for my father. And he kept blaming my poor brother for taking us out of Germany, where he knew the language and he had a business and was well-to-do and everything, and now he couldn't get started again. And my brother was not doing well getting us permission to remain in Belgium because there was a guy who was in charge, Robert Defoe was his name, and he was in charge of an organization called the Sûreté Publique, and it was like our FBI. And this Robert Defoe did not like foreign businessmen coming to Belgium to compete with Belgian businessmen. So he was not granting my brother's request for us to get legal permission to remain in Belgium. And that Robert Defoe went to the mayor of Antwerp, where we were living at the time. And that mayor of Antwerp happened to be a very fine man named Camille Huysmans, who later became Prime Minister of Belgium. And Camille Huysmans was sympathetic to the plight of the Jews. He was a socialist. And when Robert Defoe came to him and asked him to deport us to Poland, where my parents hadn't lived in 20 years, Camille Huysmans refused to deport us. So then Robert Defoe went to the federal police and they came to our apartment to deport us, but we were on a ship called the Red Star Line's SS Western Land 2 en route to the United States.
And what has been the meaning to you all your life of being an immigrant?
Well, I used to think I was an immigrant, but I found out not that long ago that I was actually a refugee.
A refugee.
Immigrant is somebody who goes from one country to another because he feels like it. But a refugee is somebody who has to get out of where he is. So we were refugees.
Right.
And you asked me what that meant to me? Well, it was connected with other things. When I got to the United States, my family got to the United States, at that time I was a month short of being 6. And then perhaps by the time I was 10, I began to realize that my life had been saved on a good many occasions. First, by my mother not having aborted me. Second, by our leaving Germany. Third, by our not being deported when we were in Belgium. Fourth, by being admitted to the United States. I put all that together with the fact that I was bright, and I came to the conclusion that my life had been saved because there was something I was supposed to do in the world to make it a better place. When I became an adult, I found out that a lot of Holocaust survivors feel that way. But I was a child. I did not know other people felt that way. I felt that way. It's a feeling that never left me. And when I was a child, I couldn't tell anybody about it because they would think that a 10-year-old child was nuts if she told them that she had a role to play to make the world a better place. So I knew that, but I couldn't mention it to anybody.
So you felt that your life had been saved because you had a purpose and you were going to make the world a better place. But
And
you also,
I also felt that I couldn't, at that time, the only thing that was expected of young women was to get married and have a family. But I felt that I could not do that because I had this other mission that I was supposed to do.
but you felt also that you lost your childhood,
Yes, true.
right? And before we talk a little bit more about that, Barbara Bloomfield has her hand up. Do you want to wait for questions to the end or should we take a question?
I don't know. I usually wait for questions at the end, but since there's only one, I can take it.
Okay, Barbara, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Barbara Bloomfield. I've lost her. Oops, she went away.
All right.
Okay, we'll just go on. So you lost your childhood a bit because of what you had to do to help your parents when you got to the US. So
Right.
where did you land first and talk a little bit about your early days in the States?
Well, the ship landed in New York City, and we got an apartment. An organization called HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, helped us find an apartment. We didn't need any other kind of help because my father had sent money to different countries when we were still in Germany, so we had money here. We didn't need any other help, but HIAS helped us to find an apartment in the Bronx, and we were living in a place called 500 Southern Boulevard. And that's where I learned to speak English. My brother was the only one of us who knew English. He had studied it in Germany and in Belgium. So there was a garden in that apartment on the ground floor, and the kids used to hang out there. So I would hang out there, and when I heard an English word, I would go upstairs to our apartment to my brother and tell him the English word, and he would tell me the German word, and that's how I learned English. I had already gone to kindergarten for a year in Antwerp, but I went again to kindergarten here, although I skipped a class somewhere along the line. And we were living in the Bronx. And my father found a partner and went into the men's clothing business in New York City. But he didn't like it. He didn't like the pace of life in New York. In Berlin, he used to be in the store till lunchtime, then he'd go home, have lunch, maybe take a nap, go back to the store, come home about 7. And of course, the pace was much more hectic in New York City. My father didn't like it. So one summer, we went for 2 weeks to the Catskill Mountains of New York for a vacation. And we came back, and my father was not one to discuss decisions with my mother. He would just announce them. So he announced to my mother that we were moving to the Catskills. And my mother said, all their lives, whenever my father went anywhere, he wanted to move there. And my mother always wanted to remain where she was. And that's how they were married for 54 years. So my mother said, no way would she be going to some small town in the Catskills from the Bronx. So my father was not much of a talker. He put on a jacket and he left the house. I just lost your picture, Barb.
I'm here.
Okay, got it back.
Okay.
So my brother said he didn't like the way my father looked and he was going to follow him. And my father went to the Harlem River and he walked in because my mother wasn't going to go with him to the Catskills. So my brother called for help and he followed my father and pulled him out of the water. And by that time, my brother said my father's eyes were rolling around in his head and he no longer knew what he was doing. And meanwhile, people came and suggested that they take an ambulance to take my father to the hospital. And my brother said, no, he'll bring him home. So he brought my father home to my mother, soaking wet. He told my mother what had happened. And my mother said, all right, we'll move to the Catskills.
Yeah, and then what happened in the Catskills? What did your parents do?
So the interesting thing is that we went to the Catskills, which was a summer resort for Jews from New York City, with the idea of getting into the resort business, which was the business there. Of course, my father had never been in the resort business, knew nothing about it, but he never gave that a thought. He was a businessman and it didn't faze him. So we went first to a little town called Woodridge, New York, and we rented a house, and we made it a kochelein, which is Yiddish for cook for yourself, as opposed to when you go to a hotel where they cook for you. And in that kochelein, people came for the summer from Memorial Day to Labor Day, and they would rent a room. And then downstairs, there would be a communal kitchen, and each woman would have a little table and an ice box and for burners. And the family would live in this room and they would eat in this communal kitchen. So I would draw up the contracts for my parents. That was my first legal work. I would draw up the contracts for the summer between these people and my parents. And my parents had that kochelein for 5 years. And then my father went to the next bigger town called Monticello, New York. And he bought 50 acres of land, 500 feet in the front, and built a bungalow colony with about 25 bungalows, a house for ourselves, a handball court, a swimming pool, and for a while we also had a small general store.
And you're still writing up the contracts.
Yes.
Right, but you are also attending school,
Right.
high school. I think around that time your brother got married.
Yes, my brother was, there's a town in between Woodridge and Monticello that was called Old Falls or Fallsburg, but there was an old falls there. And my brother was there once swimming or whatever, and he met his future wife. So he got married. He was 24. And his future wife had a brother named Abe Werman, who had a candy store in Long Beach, New York. A lot of people today don't know what a candy store is, but older people know. It was sort of a general store in a way. They had a soda fountain section. They sold newspapers, cigarettes, comic books, stuff like that. So my father bought such a store for my brother so that he could make a living because he'd gotten married. So my brother went to Long Beach and ran that store for many years. Then he became a real estate agent and an insurance agent. And one of his daughters runs that real estate office today.
And so meanwhile, you are progressing through high school, about to graduate. Talk to us about how you got to Cornell.
Well, when I was going to school, my goal was to become a secretary because that's what young women did at that time. So I took typing in high school and I liked it and I did well. But when I started high school, there were two choices. College entrance was a certain path, and another path was introduction to business. So I signed up for the introduction to business course. And the teacher who knew me, her name was Margaret Gallagher, she used to give me a ride. She rode past the road where we lived, and she often gave me a ride to school when I was waiting for the bus. And she came to me, she said, Sonia, you need to be in the college entrance program. And I said, no, I don't have any intention to go to college. I knew absolutely nothing about college. I'd never seen a college in my life. And of course, my parents were not qualified to guide me. And the guidance teachers in those days were zilch. So I didn't want to go in the college entrance course because I never thought of it. But Miss Gallagher strongly urged me to do so. So I switched to the college entrance course. And then one time I was in the ladies' room at school, and my friend Joan Rulin was there. And she said to me, are you going to college? And I said, no. And she said, well, I'm going to college and I'm going to do this and that and everything. So I was very impressed by that. Joan Rulin went to college for a year, came back to Monticello, married a hometown guy, and is living here to this day. So then a classmate of ours came to me, and I have no idea why. We didn't have any particular friendship. He was a classmate. His name was Jake Nemerson, and his father was an optometrist. So he came to me and he said that he was going to the next bigger town called Middletown, about 30 miles away, to take an exam for a scholarship. And he told me that the exam cost $7, but if you got the scholarship, you got $400. And he asked me if I wanted to go with him. So I said, I don't know, it costs $7. I have to ask my father. So I told my father misunderstood. He thought you pay $7 and you get $400. So he said to me, absolutely take it. So I went with Jake, took the exam. I won the scholarship and I was so excited. And I went to my father to tell him I had won this $400 scholarship. And he wasn't excited because that's the way he had understood it in the first place. So then, because I had won that scholarship, I took another scholarship test. It was called the New York State Scholarship. And I won that one too. So then I started to think about going to college. I don't know how I found out about Cornell. I applied only to 2 colleges because I thought that was enough. And at that time, it might have been enough. And the other one was called Hartwick College, and it was in Oneonta, New York. And they accepted me, and I accepted them. And then I was accepted by Cornell. So I told Hartwick that I was accepted at Cornell, and people told me to take that. So I accepted to go to Cornell.
Well, Miss Gallagher certainly saw something in you and pointed you in the right direction.
Yes, I was very fortunate. My parents did not want me to go to college because in the society and in the world that they grew up in, girls didn't go to college. They got married when they were 17 or 18. And my parents felt that if I went to college, any chance I had of getting married would totally be destroyed. So they didn't want me to go. But I decided that I was going to go, and I was going to go, and then my brother came into the house. He only lived a few doors. At that time we had sold the bungalow colony. We were living in Long Beach. We were only a few doors away from my brother. So my brother comes into the house. He spent about 2 hours ranting and raving why I shouldn't go to college. Of course, he had no authority over me. But he always tried to act a little bit as if he were my father because he was 14 years my senior. But I always told him I have a father and it's not you. So he left after his 2-hour harangue, and I packed my bags and I went to, oh no, I was thinking of going to, when I went to law school.
No, right.
My father and mother drove me to Cornell.
Right. And what did you study there?
I studied everything because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So my first major was Latin because I took about 4 years of Latin in Monticello. I had a wonderful Latin teacher, Stuart Gay, and he always gave me A+. One time I got an A- and I went to complain about my grade, but I love Latin and I love languages. So I started out as a language major. And I saw myself as an interpreter at the UN. And then after about a year or two of that, I said to myself, what is it such a big deal to interpret languages? The other people are the ones who are making the decisions. I'm just the interpreter. This is not anything, so I need to switch. So I switched to psychology and I became a psych major. And I did that for about a year. And then somebody said to me, Sonia, you know, if you want to do something in psychology, you have to do graduate work. And I said, oh, that is out of the question. Nobody in my family ever went to the first grade. I'm certainly not going to go do graduate work. So I need to switch to something else. So then I didn't know what to switch to, and I was so desperate. And I had a friend in home economics. I was going to go to home economics and take meat cutting. I had a course in meat cutting. And somehow, thank God, I found my way. Cornell at that time had a system that you could do your senior year of Cornell in their graduate school of business and public administration. That was a 2-year school, but you could do the first year of it as your senior year. So I did my senior year in the graduate school of business and public administration, and then I graduated.
And tell us about your first job. What happened? Your first job.
Well, I thought that, my God, what kind of jobs will be offered to me, a college graduate, Phi Beta Kappa? So nobody was offering me a job. And I sent out 200 letters to big corporations around the country, sending them my resume and saying that I was looking for my first job. And I did not get a single answer. So meanwhile, everybody was saying, go to secretarial school. I kept saying, but I have a college degree. But then I realized those people were right. I already had typing. So I went to the Brown Business School in Hempstead, New York, and I studied shorthand. And I used to go break shorthand, and I used to go to school in the morning. And then I came back, and my mother would spend the afternoon dictating to me, and I would write in shorthand what she dictated. So I studied shorthand for about 2.5 months. I had a terrific speed, and I quit and got a job immediately as a secretary.
You were a secretary for about 4 years. And then what happened?
Various things happened in my life, and I realized that as a secretary, I was getting nowhere fast. So my parents and I used to go to Miami Beach for the winters. It started when I was a child, and the doctor thought I had asthma, and he told my parents to take me to a warmer climate. So we started spending the winters in Miami Beach. And one time I drove past the University of Miami, and it was a lovely campus. And I thought, oh, how nice it would be to go here. And then I realized that I'd already graduated from college. So then I said, well, but I could go to law school. So I applied to law school at the University of Miami and was accepted and started there in 1954.
And I remember that you told me that, I think it was in the Catskills, your parents had a husband and wife law team. So you had already you'd seen the possibility of a woman as a lawyer.
Exactly right. They were named Joe and Ethel Cooperman. They lived in Ellenville, New York. And my father used to invest in second mortgages, and they were our lawyers. And I was friendly with them. So I had the role model, thank you for reminding me, of a woman lawyer.
Right. And so at that point, when you were in law school, tell us about that experience.
Well, again, my parents didn't want me to go. I think that's the time that my brother came to the house and carried on. And I took a train, went to law school. And they put me up in an apartment with 3 other women. And they were not law students. They were in the undergraduate school. And I had a roommate who must have had mental problems. because one morning I woke up and she was screaming that I had moved her hairbrush from where it was on the dresser to another place. And she was carrying on. So I took, from then on, I slept on the floor in the living room. I didn't want to share a room with her anymore. So I sent a letter to my parents and I told them that I was down here, but that I was having some difficulties with this roommate. And my mother read the letter to my father and he didn't say anything. He went to another room in the house and she went to see what he was doing and he was packing a bag. And my mother said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Didn't you hear that letter?" And she said, "Yeah." And he referred to the fact that I had written that I was having some difficulties because I had to grocery shop for myself in that apartment that I didn't have a car. So my father said he has to go down and buy me a car. My mother says, "What are you talking about? It's Erev Rosh Hashanah. You can't go now." And my father said, "Didn't you hear that letter? The girl needs a car." So my father got on a train and came down to Miami Beach and called me to tell me he was there. And my father had a strong Yiddish accent, but he didn't have it on the telephone. So I pick up the phone and I said, "Hello, who is this?" And he says, "It's your father." And he didn't have a strong Yiddish accent. So I thought maybe it was this guy, Hal, that I'd been dating, because he also spent time in Miami Beach. So I said, "Is this Hal?" And he said, "No, it's your father." I said, "My father's in Long Beach. Who are you?" He said, "I'm your father." I said, "If you're my father, what's my Yiddish name?" He said, "Scheindel." I said, "Hi, Dad." So he came over, bought me, he bought me a car then. And he saw that I was sleeping on the floor in the living room. He didn't say anything. He went back home and he said to my mother, "We have to move to Miami Beach." And my mother said, "Why is that?" And he said, "The girl is sleeping on the floor and we have to buy a house so she can live with us while she goes to law school." So within 2 weeks, my brother was a realtor at that time. So they gave the house to my brother to sell. My parents came down to North Miami Beach, bought a house, and I lived with them while I went to law school, which they didn't want me to go to and for which they paid.
Right. You mentioned to me that at that time, women were only 3% of your law school class, but
3% of the graduating law school students in 1957, yes.
and you were one of them. So tell us about your first job after you got out of law school.
My first job when I got out of law school was in Washington, D.C. I'd been going to the University of Miami Law School and recruiters came down. And one of the professors at the law school made an appointment for me to see the recruiters. I had no interest in going to Washington whatsoever, but this Professor Minette Massey made an appointment for me. So I took a job with the United States Department of Justice, Office of Alien Property, and that was my first job after law school.
Right. And so that agency closed, I believe. And then what happened? What did you do?
After I was there about a year and a half, 2 years, they announced that that agency was closing. It would first become part of Justice, integral part of Justice. It was always a part of Justice, but it was a separate agency. And now it was going to become an integral part of Justice and then be closed. So I had to find myself another job. And a guy named Paul Elkind, who I had met at the Office of Alien Property, had left the agency and gotten himself another job. So I called him up and I told him I now had to find another job. Well, first of all, the Justice Department told us that they would find, I was on a program called the Attorney General's Program for Graduates. And we were told that the Justice Department would get all of us on that program jobs. And some man standing with me said they can't do that. And I said to him, what do you mean they can't do that? And he turned out to be right. They couldn't get us jobs. We had to get ourselves jobs. So I called up this Paul Elgin and I said, you just went job hunting and you found yourself a job. Do you have any agencies you suggest I go to? So he said, come here. He was at the National Labor Relations Board. He said, they have openings.
Right. And you went to the Pittsburgh field office at that point and
No.
then California? No,
At that point.
I'm sorry.
I worked at headquarters at that point. After I was,
And then Pittsburgh.
and then the Pittsburgh field office, and then the Los Angeles field office, and then back to headquarters.
Exactly. Okay. So then what happened after that?
Well, while I had these different jobs, and it never left me that there was some special job that I was supposed to do, and I was always looking for that job. So while I was working at headquarters, there was this guy. He was a trial examiner for the National Labor Relations Board, but he always he liked women, and he used to always take me out for lunch and promise me that he would help me find a better job or a different job, but he never did. So one day I had just had lunch with him when I met my friend Jackie Shepard, who later became Jackie Williams. And she said, how are you? And I said, oh, I just had another one of those lunches where this Art Christopher promises me he'll get me another job and nothing ever comes of it. And she said, oh, if you want another job, my former teacher at the Howard Law School, Charlie Duncan, just became general counsel of a brand new agency, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and he's looking for people. Why don't you go over there?
So at that point, you did, but you found that you needed a reference from a congressman.
That's correct. Charlie Duncan hired me as the first woman attorney in the general counsel's office at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But he said I would have to provide him with a congressman's reference. So I had heard Senator Edmund Muskie speak at one point, and his parents were immigrants to this country. So I had written to him telling him I'm an immigrant and maybe he can help me find a job, and nothing came of that. But when I was told that I needed a congressional reference, I remembered that, and I contacted his office to ask whether he could give me a reference. So he referred me to somebody who worked for him named George Mitchell. And I called George Mitchell for the reference. And at that time he was in Maine. Edmund Muskie, I think, had been governor of Maine. Later on, George Mitchell became governor of Maine. He also was the congressman. So I called George Mitchell and said I needed a reference for this job with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And he said to me he was in Maine, but he was just flying into Washington, D.C. He'd be staying at the Mayflower Hotel. And why didn't I meet him there for a drink? I thought this was an odd way to get a reference, but I needed a reference. So I went, I met him, we had a drink. He told me his wife had just given birth to their first baby. We danced, and he said he'd give me the reference, and then he walked me to the front door, but before we came to the door, there was an elevator there, and he asked me to go up to his room with him. So I said no, and he immediately apologized, and he said something that I've never forgotten. He's to excuse himself. He said, a man is a delicate seismological instrument. So I left, took a cab home, and berated myself because I said, here I had an opportunity for the kind of job that I've been looking for, and I turned George Mitchell down. And I've read so many books about women like Evita Peron and many others who slept their way to good jobs, and what was wrong with me? but George Mitchell got me the reference.
Right. So you did get the job. Tell us about the work you did there.
Well, so that was an agency enforcing a new law that prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin by employers, employment agencies, and labor unions. And that law was passed as a result of the movement for Blacks, the civil rights movement. And most of the people there were there to do something about racial discrimination in this country in employment. But just about at the last minute of the act's passing, a congressman from Virginia, Howard Smith, introduced an amendment. At that time, the legislation did not prohibit sex discrimination in employment, only race, color, religion. And he introduced an amendment to include sex discrimination. His motives, we don't really know. He was close to Alice Paul, a feminist, and they didn't want Black people gaining rights at the expense of white women. So maybe he sincerely wanted that amendment, but he voted against it later on. Or he might have wanted to kill. He thought that by adding the sex discrimination, perhaps he would delay the act's passage or keep it from being passed altogether. But nobody was going to go up and speak against prohibiting gender discrimination, and the act passed with that in it. But in the early days, there were about 100 people at headquarters at the EEOC, and most of them had come there to fight employment discrimination based on race. So they didn't want the commission's resources, money, and time devoted to matters of gender discrimination. And also, there was no women's movement immediately before the passage of that act. Nobody knew how the provisions of the act prohibiting sex discrimination were to be interpreted. They raised difficult legal questions. So for the first year and a quarter, year and a half, the EOC didn't do much about gender discrimination. So when I saw that, that got me upset. And I was always raising the issue of sex discrimination, so much so that my boss, the general counsel, took to calling me a sex maniac.
And just about that time, I think you met Betty Friedan. Tell us about that.
Betty Friedan in 1963 had written The Feminine Mystique. The EOC opened on July 2nd, 1965. And Betty Friedan thought she was going to write a book about all the progress that women had achieved since The Feminine Mystique. So she came to my office to interview the general counsel and his deputy for this book thought she was going to write about all the progress women had made. But she saw me there. I was the only woman in the general counsel's office. So she came over to me. She said, "What are the problems here? What are the issues? What's going on?" So I said to myself, if I tell her, I might lose my job because the EOC wasn't doing anything about women's rights. So I said, everything fine here. So 2 weeks later, she came back again and she asked me again, and she caught me at a vulnerable moment. So I took her into my office, and with tears running down my cheeks, I told her that the commission wasn't doing anything for women, and that what this country needed was an organization to fight for women like the NAACP fought for its constituents.
And out of that conversation came now.
Well, it wasn't as simple as that. There were other people perhaps telling her the same thing. And then there was a meeting in Washington in June or July of 1966. And certain things happened at that meeting, and Betty Friedan was there. It was a meeting of the commissions on the status of women from the whole country. And at that time, 28 women got together at lunch. I was not present at that meeting. And Betty Friedan on a napkin wrote that we're going to start now to bring women into first-class status in the United States.
Isaac has told me that we have about 5 or 10 minutes left, and we're at an important point in your life, because now you're really doing the work that you always felt that you.
I'm going to hang up my phone. Okay.
Yeah. Now you're finally doing the work that you really wanted to do, which was fight for women. Talk a little bit about that, and then we need to move to the fact that you wrote a book and move to Sarasota, and then we want to open it to questions.
But you just told me we're out of time. So
we've got about 5 or 10 minutes, so I'm just moving us along a little bit.
Okay, so what do you want me to talk about?
Tell us a little bit of, the work that you did for women. There was the case with the stewardesses.
Yeah, I'll mention
a little bit of the work you did, and then I want you to talk a little bit about the fact that you wrote a book and what you've been doing since you got to Sarasota.
All right. So at the EOC, I became very involved in women's rights. And I became known for that, and I began to work with other men and women throughout the federal government who also cared about women's rights. And I went to a second meeting at which now was founded in October of 1966, and I played a role there. So there were 5 commissioners at the EOC. A couple of them had an interest in women's rights. The others didn't. Some people at the EOC were absolutely opposed to rights for women. And that included the vice chairman, Luther Holcomb. It included the executive director. It included the deputy general counsel. There were other people at the EOC who perhaps favored women's rights, but they didn't speak up, or they worked for people who didn't favor it. I had no problem in speaking up. The most important thing I did there was that among the early charges that were filed with the EOC were charges filed by women then called stewardesses and today called flight cabin attendants. They had earlier filed charges in New York City with the New York City Commission, but when the EOC opened up, they came right to the EOC. And they were complaining about the fact that all United States airlines at that time terminated or grounded stewardesses when they got married or turned 32 or 35. The airlines also employed pursers. They used the stewardesses on domestic flights. They used pursers on international flights. The job was the same, but none of those restrictions applied to pursers. So they complained about that. I had the great privilege of writing the commission's decision that found that that was unlawful.
Perfect. And I know we're skipping a little bit in the interest of time, but you did write this wonderful book. And I know it took you a number of years. Tell us just a little bit. Well, start with the wonderful title.
The title is, oh my God, I can't think of it.
Eat first. Eat first.
Eat first. You don't know what they'll give you. The Adventures of an Immigrant Family and Their Feminist Daughter. I wrote it after I retired from the federal government, and a lot of people had told me that I should write a book, but I thought that I should write a book about the early cases of the EOC, and I was going to write that book, and then I met a woman editor who said to me, that isn't the book you want to write. You want to write a book about your parents and yourself and your lives, the kind of stories you've been telling me, because I went out to coffee with this woman. So it took me 5.5 years, and I wrote a memoir, which is written with humor, and it was about the kind of things I've been talking to you about today.
And that's where I first met Sonia, because she was giving a review of her book, and it's a very worthwhile read. I'm not her shill, but I recommend the book. So briefly tell us about some of the things that you've done since you got to Sarasota. You had an interview yesterday, I think, or the day before, that sounds fabulous, and another one coming up. And I know you've given tons of talks about your life and about women's fight for equality.
Well, what I've done since I came to Sarasota, which I started coming here many years ago, but I would only come for a short time. And then I moved here full time in 2006, in the fall of 2006. One thing I do is I have a worldwide feminist email list. And every day I try to read online the New York Times, the Washington Post, the local paper, Facebook, and then if I see articles of interest to women involving women's rights, I send those to my worldwide list. I've done a good bit of writing, and I continue to do that. I give speeches all the time, or I'm interviewed like this one. And you mentioned an interview that I had yesterday or the day before. I was interviewed as a Holocaust survivor by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And at the end of this month, I will be interviewed by Steven Spielberg's USC Shoah Foundation. The Shoah Foundation had asked me years ago to be interviewed, but I didn't think I fit in because I wasn't in a concentration camp. I didn't have any physical horrors done to me. I just had my life disrupted. But I've changed my mind because these organizations do want to interview me, and because I come within the definition of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for Holocaust survivors.
Okay, I think we're going to open it to questions, and I've already got a really interesting comment here from, he just identifies himself as W. Frank. So I don't know his first name, but I will let him tell you.
It's Walter Frank.
Okay, Walter, if you would like to mention to Sonia what you wrote, it's wonderful.
Coincidentally, I also arrived on the Western Down. It was January 1st, 1938.
Oh, wow. It was no longer owned by the same people at that time, though.
I thought it was Helen American Line, wasn't it?
Are you talking about the Red Star Line?
No, I thought you said Western Down. No.
The line was the Red Star Line. The ship was the SS Western Land 2.
Oh, okay. No, I was on the Western Down.
Another line.
Nancy Cohen, unmute yourself.
Thank you so much for this. You're talking about the Cajalain in the Catskills. I grew up, my grandparents had one. What was the name of your Cajalain?
The Cajalain didn't have a name.
Oh, where was it?
It was in Woodridge.
Well,
but the
they would
bungalow
go every summer,
oh.
And they had a room and they shared a kitchen. My grandmother was very lucky because she had a kitchen to herself. And my memories from there, you brought tears to my eyes. It's very special because I really don't think of it very much, but it was a very important time of my life. So thank you.
My pleasure, but our bungalow colony had a name. It was on the Port Jervis Road from Monticello, and it was called the Pine Tree Bungalow Colony.
That's where my grandparents were.
Really?
That's where they were, yes. And they used to have entertainment where everybody would come and they do all kinds of shows. And it was just such an incredible experience, and it's been buried. And thank you for unburying it.
Thank you for sharing that. Phyllis Lieberman, unmute yourself.
I can't even imagine what it was like for you to go to law school in 1957.
No, I graduated in 57.
Graduated when you went in 54. I can't hardly even imagine what that was like. I am just so taken with your ability to do these things that you did in the 50s, because that's kind of when I grew up too. I mean, I went to law school in 1983 when there were already 50% of the class were lawyers, but I can hardly imagine you're doing the kinds of things that you did in the 50s, especially with such an authoritarian father that you had, and where you had the wherewithal somehow to make these decisions and do them, and to change your life and to go to strange places all on your own at a time when I think it was most unusual. So I don't know what you went through emotionally to get to these points that you did, because we're hearing things now, it's many, many years later. But I'm just, you know, so impressed with your ability to do that, especially since it sounds like your mom pretty much had to do whatever your father said. So I don't know where you got the strength somehow to make these kind of decisions.
My mother was a strong person too. But my father was in some ways authoritarian, but he loved me very much. And he never denied me anything. So it was not a problem for me with them. I always did. What the problem was that I could have used some guidance. You know, if I'd had American parents, I would have had some guidance, which my parents couldn't give me because they didn't have that experience. But other than that, anything I ever wanted to do, whether they were for it or not, I was able to do. My father would have cut off his arms and legs if he would have thought it would help me for 5 minutes.
That's exactly right. I mean, we heard that when they moved to Miami and bought a house so you'd have a place to live,
Exactly.
and bought you a car.
They were just,
devotion.
my parents were incredible.
Other questions? And, you know, I think there's a second page I should be looking. I don't see any hands. So, you know, if I'm missing you, oh, yes, Judith Glass. The phrase of the 20s, unmute yourself. That's the phrase of 2020. Unmute yourself, please, Judith. There you go.
Sonia, you've had an incredible life, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. To be honest, I was hoping you would talk more about the women's lib movement, but you seem to have grown personally as well as professionally from the time you sent that guy away from the elevator until you finally were fighting for women's rights. And you didn't go too much into your personal history with, I don't know whether you were married or you weren't married, but in the end, what do you think was the most important takeaway from the women's lib movement, which was so mammoth for me and for our generation, but hardly, I mean, the term is hardly even used today. Is that because girls today just take it for granted what you accomplished?
A lot of answers. I'll try to answer all your questions. The reason I didn't talk that much about women's rights, I used to give talks on all the developments happening in women's rights, but it used to take me about 3 months of research to write one of those speeches and go into all the developments and all the changes in the law that happened. And I did that for many years. And then after I retired, I didn't want to work so hard anymore. So I changed my topic to talking about my life and work, rather than having to do all this research about women's rights. I was married. I got married when I was 42 years old. I married a Puerto Rican. He had been married before. We had a daughter. I got divorced when my daughter was about 7. That's that. She's married and lives in California. As to my work, I was always involved with a group of people in Washington that were fighting on different legal issues. But I think you asked me you asked me whether that people aren't talking about it anymore.
Well, what is the most important development or change
thank
as a
you.
result of your involvement in the women's lib movement that still is, made a difference today to today's young women?
Okay. I have with me material from other speeches where I talk about 20 issues. I just picked 20 issues, that isn't all there is. Where I talk about 20 issues for women that we still need to fight today. The most important thing that I saw was that the changes we made after we founded Now were way beyond the changes those of us who founded Now ever expected to see in our lifetimes. We just wanted, at that time, we wanted the EOC to enforce the law for women, which it wasn't doing in the beginning. But we wanted women to be admitted into colleges and universities, which they wasn't happening. And we wanted women to be treated equally as employees, to get hired, to get promoted, to get certain jobs. None of that was happening. We did not expect to make the worldwide revolution that we made. I used to say to Betty Friedan, did you ever think we would live to see the changes we have lived to see? None of us were going for all of that. None of us thought of all of that. We thought about those things that I've told you, but instead it was a legal revolution in this country, and I've spoken all over the world, and it's all over the world. So to me, on the one hand, the status of women that I have lived to see change is the most gratifying thing. But that is not to say we don't have huge issues still to deal with.
We still don't have equal pay, and but I think Judith is right in that. I mean, I certainly know with my daughter-in-law, they do take a lot of it for granted. And I don't think that they are fighting in the way that some of us were. I'm very concerned about the fact that the pandemic has put women way back.
Yes, I just read an article, I have it here, then that the pandemic has put women back a generation.
I absolutely feel qualified to speak to this. 100%.
Tell them how you
Women my age take a great deal for granted. I never even considered when I was in college and in my early 20s that signing a lease for an apartment, opening a checking account, getting a credit card was something that my mother couldn't do. I just took it for granted that I could do that. I never considered limitations that my mother had. And one very interesting thing, when I was in high school, my mother said, if I were living now, if I had had the choices that you have, I would have gone into the military. I would have gone to West Point. My mother.
Yeah.
Now, for me, a military career, absolutely nothing I considered. But when I was a senior in high school, I had a general who was participating in a Voice of Democracy situation, and then in a Memorial Day ceremony, come up to me and say, you would make a lovely officer. Have you considered applying to a military school? Now, once again, look at it this time, you wouldn't say that, but I had opportunities, and my generation and the ones that have come after me have. I also agree, though, that this pandemic situation and what is happening now is a real eye-opener for my generation and women who are younger than I am, that there is still, yes, a lot of fighting that has to be done. And there has been a major backslide. So this is an interesting topic for me, most definitely.
So we have to hope that young women pick up the mantle from people like Sonia, and carry on working for equality.
I don't have any problems about that, Barbara, because those are the women I'm in touch with all the time. And they're fighting just as we were fighting. Now is very active, and other organizations are active, and the fight goes on. But we have certainly lost ground because of the pandemic, because most of the jobs that were lost were jobs that women held.
Who had to stay home with their kids who were being, well, not homeschooled, but taking classes remotely. So do we have a time limit, Isaac? Are we at it?
Actually, I think we can continue another 10 minutes if you wish.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, then maybe,
The chicken's been warming. You want chicken soup
okay.
with matzo ball?
I see a question from the blue glasses.
Well, absolutely.
Hi, yes, hi. I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your life. And it was inspiring, to say the least. And what I was most struck with, besides the fact of the things that you have done, was that you had somehow you felt a mission early in your life. You mentioned it, that you were going to do something different and special. You were put on this earth, or you were your life took a turn so that you would have to do something valuable, and you are and have fulfilled that. You are still fulfilling that, and so that's a wonderful testament to your life. And I think if I could pick one thing that struck me, that would say that is so significant about what you talked about and how it seems that you are, is when you complained about your A-. Right then I said, okay, that's a ghost starter person. So kudos to you for everything that you've done, and thank you from a woman to a woman.
Thank you so much.
Sandra, unmute.
Yes, thank you very much. It was quite interesting, Sonia.
Thank
I'm
you.
wondering, it's kind of depressing to hear that with all the Washington lawyers that there have been and there are today, there was only one lawyer in the EEOC, one female lawyer in EEOC. What would you say was the cause of the lack of emphasis? And particularly since when the Higher Ed Acts were passed and the Anti-Discrimination Acts were passed, the federal government sued every single southern state to desegregate their higher ed system, and they had to do that. But there was no such orders to make sure that there was any equal rights for women versus men at those times. So why was there a lack of, or what caused there to be such a lack of interest in the support of women, even though the EEOC was established?
Well, first of all, the EEOC had authority only in the area of employment, and only dealing with employers, employment agencies, and labor unions. And in the beginning, it didn't have any power to institute lawsuits. That came later, but in the beginning, it only could make decisions and try to conciliate the matter. Lawsuits were within the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice, and they had to find a pattern of practice. The first thing that and I wasn't the only woman at the EOC. There was a woman commissioner, Eileen Hernandez. There were other women, but except for the commissioners, the other women were not speaking up. I was, and I was in the general counsel's office. So I was in a place I could speak up. The first reason they didn't do anything was, as I mentioned, the sex discrimination only came in the latter part of the debates. Nobody had thought about it. Nobody wanted it. And the people who came there, most of, just about all of them, came to fight racial discrimination. This business about sex discrimination came out of left field. Nobody expected it. There was no women's movement before it. So those people were there to fight discrimination against Blacks. They didn't want their time and their money of the agency to be diverted to this thing, women's rights, which wasn't an issue at that time. Nobody cared about it. Then, however, there was a second reason. the law that prohibited discrimination against for race and religion were pretty much clear cut. What was racial discrimination, what was religious discrimination, didn't raise a lot of questions, some, but not a lot. But the prohibition against sex discrimination raised all kinds of issues. For example, did you have to hire a pregnant woman? None of this had been debated. Nobody talked about it. In the past, people didn't hire pregnant women. Did Title VII require that you have to hire a pregnant woman? Before Title VII, schools used to routinely discharge women teachers when they became pregnant. Was that now going to be unlawful? Then there was the question of a bona fide occupational qualification, or BFOQ. The act had a provision that if sex was a BFOQ for a job, you could discriminate on the basis of sex. So employers in the beginning were saying that just about every job, sex is a BFOQ for it, and we can discriminate. It took a while, but the commission, for example, they argued that in the stewardess cases. They said only women can do this job, and therefore sex is a bona fide occupational qualification. And we can hire only women, and we can treat them any way we want, because Title VII only requires equality. So there were a bunch of issues that had to be determined. And that's why it took about 1.5 years until the commission really got going.
Thank you.
Oh, and we also had women wrote in and said, my husband's a policeman. I don't want him riding in a police car all day long next to a woman. Those were all novel issues. We decided them, but they were all novel issues.
So do you see that this current administration that we have in Washington now will strengthen the role of the EEOC since it became under the previous one?
I have no question about it.
Thank you.
But the basic question about why equality of the genders is the very last thing to happen is a good one, you know, but that requires another hour, 2 hours of conversation to dissect. Maybe that's Sonia's next book.
Not writing another book. That one took me 5.5 years.
Other questions? Yes, Gloria. Unmute. You know, they have to fix
Okay.
Zoom. We can mute you, but we can't unmute you. So.
I understand. I just want to make a statement about being a stewardess. When I went to school and graduated as a registered nurse, all I ever wanted to do was be a stewardess because I thought it would be a great opportunity to travel. However, when I went for my interview, let's say, first of all, you couldn't wear eyeglasses.
Correct.
Second of all, I was 10 pounds over and I was a size 8 at that time. Somehow I lost it in between. You couldn't be married, which I wasn't. But I mean, there were so many restrictions. I said, oh, and then I found out years later that in the 50s, if you were in your 50s, they were hiring stewardesses because they had a shortage. And then when I look at them today or along the way, I said, oh my God, and I couldn't get a job.
All those restrictions were in effect, but they're all gone now because of the EOC.
Right. Thank you.
Anyone else? I don't see any.
Anything else? Anybody else?
I don't. Yes. Yeah, I know you're not Carol. Sean.
I'm Stuart. Carol's lesser half. But one of my
you could rename yourself if you want.
One of my fondest jobs as a lawyer, and I went to Michigan, and when I graduated in 1966, there were 3 women in our class. That was 1966. But a number of years later, after being with corporate firms and doing merger and acquisition work, a group came to me of feminists. How they found me, I don't know. But one of their members was Gloria Steinem. And they were buying a what was called the Women's City Club in the middle of Detroit, a very elegant club that had fallen into disrepair after the good white people of our community left downtown. And it was an elegant building. So I handled the transaction of buying the building. They had a grand opening with every feminist that was in Detroit coming to it. And of course, I was invited along with my wife, and Gloria was there. And I have a picture with Gloria. That was one of my favorite pictures. I had it up on a wall for a long time.
Excuse me, they're bringing my dinner and I just have to open the door.
You can
Anyway,
keep
that's
telling us.
my feminist story.
Well, good for you for helping.
Uh,
Did I see another hand? I thought I might have. The gold fire, it was someone right in that area. No. We'll wait for Sonia to put her dinner down and come in. Here she is.
Sorry about that.
Good you had pants on, Sonia.
What?
I said, it's good you had pants on.
Oh,
That was another restriction. Many schools did not let women wear slacks.
wait a minute, I'm in the middle of that lawsuit. There's a lawsuit going on now.
Really?
Yes.
Talk a minute about that.
Oh, well, I used to be on a website called allexperts.com. And people in different fields were on that website. And if you had a question in their field, you would ask the question. So one day a woman came to me and her name was Bonnie Peltier. And she told me that she was living in a town in North Carolina. She had never gotten married, but she had 2 children. And she had moved to this town from another town because she thought it would be a better school for her children. And she had a boy and a girl in elementary school. And her daughter came home and complained because the school had a sex segregated dress code. And girl students could not wear slacks or shorts. This was while Hillary Clinton was running for president wearing slacks all the time. Girl students could not wear slacks or shorts, nor could female teachers. So this woman, Bonnie Peltier, said to me, do you think that's unlawful? I said, are you kidding me? I can't believe that's going on. I think the year was 2015 at the time. I said, are you kidding me? I can't believe this is going on. The town was Leland, North Carolina. So she said, could I do anything about it? I said, yes, you could file a complaint, take them to court. But I said, I must warn you that if you file a complaint, even though it's against the law, you may have trouble at that school and your kids may have trouble at that school. And I want you to be aware of that. And you need to think it over whether you want to pursue this. So she said she did. And I was very fortunate. I found her a lawyer with the ACLU through the help of my friend Sue Klein, who's with Ms. Magazine now. And the lawyer I found was Amy Katz, and she's with the ACLU. And she got additional ACLU lawyers, and they filed a complaint, and they won it in the lower court. But that school has taken it to appeal, and it was recently heard by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And it'll take a while till they make a decision. The lower court ruled for us. I would have never believed such a case would take so long. But there's an older gentleman who started this school, and I love his reasons why he has the segregated dress code. Gave 2 reasons. One was chivalry, and I can't explain it. And the second reason was that he said, if the students and teachers at Columbine High School had worn dresses and skirts, those shootings would not have taken place.
Oh, my God.
Oh, my goodness. So that case was just heard. A woman named Galen Sherwin just argued it for our side, for the ACLU, and it'll take a while for the decision to come down.
Amazing that that's happening today. We have work to do.
That's my case.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a lot of fun. I love my friend Sonia, and it's just always fun for me. I don't care how many times I've led her through her life story. I hear new tidbits and learn more about her each time. It's just fun. So thank you for being such a responsive audience.
Sonia and Barb, I want to thank you so much. Please, all of us unmute and give her a round of applause for an amazing presentation. So we really appreciate it very much that you shared your experiences with us. And I wish we had hours upon hours to unfold many of the beginning of stories that you gave us all along. There's a book in every sentence, Sonia. That is really amazing, truly amazing. Thank you. Rabbi, you want to?
Yes. Let me just thank Sonia and all of us for being here this evening. This expanded our horizons considerably. If you're ever willing, we'd love to have you come back and tell us more, because I know there's so much more you could share with us. Let me announce Friday night service at 7:30. If you can't make it at 7:30, you can get it on YouTube or Facebook tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Let's learn more. Let's expand our horizons. Let's speak up for the rights of those who are oppressed. A very appropriate theme at this time of Passover. Good Shabbos to everybody, and thanks
Good
again.
Shabbos.
Thank you, everybody.
We're leaving.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Sonia. That was magnificent.
It was a pleasure to be with your people.
We'll have you back if you ever have time for us, perhaps in a morning session where we have a little more time. You talk about other aspects, but thank you so much. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah. It is recorded in case someone asks for a recording.
I would like to have a recording if you have one.
I will send it to you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very good. Very good. I will remain until everyone is off the screen. And
All right.
again, I can't thank you enough.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach lach.
Chag Sameach, and I'm going to sign out because I've got to get ourselves together for later.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sonia, do you speak French?
My brother told me that I spoke Flemish when
Flemish,
we
yeah.
were in Antwerp, but not anymore.
Right, right, right. You know, I have a sister who lives in Amsterdam, and then they speak something akin, you know, to Belgian Flemish.
I have an Israeli cousin who is about 33 years old. He's in the computer field.
Yeah.
And he's moving to Amsterdam this July.
Oh, terrific. If she needs someone local, a connection, let me know. I'll be glad to
I
give
will tell him.
Dorit's phone number. She speaks Hebrew fluently.
Oh,
as well.
wow.
Yeah. So
I will tell him. I'm very close to that cousin.
yeah, I'll be glad to make the connection. They can take her to shul or yeah, you know. Yeah. So that's good.
Wonderful.
That's a good shidduch, you know.
I have connections in Antwerp because there's a museum there now called the Red Star Line Museum.
Oh.
based on that shipping line that I came to America on, and they have an exhibit about me there.
Oh,
So when my cousin goes to Amsterdam, he's gonna go to Antwerp to see my exhibit.
yes, yes, we drove from Amsterdam to Antwerp. It's not that bad. I think it's
No,
a couple of hours by car.
I've done it too.
And Antwerp is very nice. I like Antwerp. Lots of diamond activity, at least
Yes.
it used to be in the past. I don't know.
Still is. I bought diamond earrings there.
Yeah, oh, okay, okay. Terrific, terrific.
You go to Amsterdam to see your sister,
Yeah,
take a ride and go see this Red Star Line Museum.
I will. Last trip, I concentrated on the museums in Amsterdam. There are so many of them.
I've done that too.
They reopened the Rembrandt Museum, so I had to go see it.
I didn't see that. I went to the Van Gogh Museum there.
And the Van Gogh, yes, the Van Gogh, the Rijksmuseum. What else? And some other, smaller museum of, Delft porcelain and things of that nature. But
And I took a wonderful boat ride there.
yes, I did too. So that's wonderful. Thank you, Sonia. I can't thank you enough. It's been, too short. Yeah, Audrey, how are you?
Fine, thank you. I was fascinated listening to this presentation and very impressed. I'm always, is it too late to ask a question?
Sure, go ahead. If Sonia wants to answer. Yeah,
I can, I will.
Are you willing? I'm always interested in the decisions that people make. Well, first of all, I was an interviewer for the Shoah Foundation. I did 53 interviews in Connecticut, and I'm glad that they are taking your interview at this point. I know they had considered themselves finished, but always can make exceptions. I'm always interested in the decisions people make that result in survival. And you mentioned that your parents had been reluctant to make a decision to leave Europe, and one of their choices didn't work out, and then all of a sudden your family was on board a ship to the United States. I was interested to know how they managed to get exit permission, and how they managed to get access to the United States.
I don't have good answers for you on those two questions. I can tell you what I know, which isn't a lot. I was told that by my brother that we came on our Polish passports, not on German passports. But I spent a lot of time with a professor at the University of Ghent who went over all my papers in the Brussels archives. And he said he thought it was harder for people to come to the United States on Polish passports. So I can't understand that. The only thing I know is that my brother never stopped running around, and this is in his diary, which is online. He never stopped running around trying to work something out for us. And he must have done all that. There was nobody else who would have done it. And he somehow arranged it. I don't know any details of that, and I don't think the details are in his diary, but he was constantly going to different offices and agencies. Initially, he was trying to get us to have permission to remain in Antwerp. It was only when we couldn't get that he started with the United States, but I don't know more than that.
Well, thank you. I think it was his determination. I think you're right. That has to be the most likely explanation, that he found some way, because there were massive numbers of people trying to get to the United States at that time. So it was really a coup for him to have been able to make those arrangements to save your family.
Not only that, I read a few years ago that in 1938, only 4 years later, Anne Frank's father wanted to come to the United States with his family, and he had connections here, which we did not have, and he was turned down.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. You know, it was very difficult.
So I don't know.
United States didn't exactly throw open their doors to the European Jews either.
But I was told that between 1934 and 1938, they tightened up.
Yes, I know.
But otherwise, but we had no special connections and no special nothing, no. But my brother was very active in crime.
Well, I'm sure you can thank him for your family's survival. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. Your career is impressive. Your determination is impressive. And I commend you. Thank you for presenting to
Thank
all.
you very much.
Thank you, thank you. And that's coming from a very impressive person as well. Audrey's been conferred a honorary doctorate degree for her work in the sciences. So she's one of our first scientists, women scientists. And we appreciate her very much.
Wonderful.
So, okay.
By the way, I didn't have a chance to tell, somebody said when she went to law school years later, there were only 3 women there or something.
Yeah.
There were 11 women in my class out of about,
Really? Wow.
out of about 169. I have the statistics. And women were 7.9% of my class at the University of Miami Law School were women.
Yeah.
And a law professor who's a friend of mine from Cornell said that a less prestigious school like the University of Miami Law School was more apt to take women.
Yeah. How was the graduation rate for women? Was it less than men, percentage-wise, or the same or more?
I don't have any numbers on
Yeah,
that.
yeah. That would be interesting to see, you know, the determination of women really wanting to go through with it, as opposed to, you know, some of the playboys that end up in law school because daddy wants them to, you know.
Well, I was surprised when I went to law school because I went, that law was like a mission. It was a profession. But
Right.
there were plenty of people in my class that studied law like you would study plumbing.
Yeah, yeah. And my son's a lawyer and he's a real estate lawyer. Basically a transactional lawyer, like a business person.
Right,
you know?
right.
Doesn't know much about the constitutional law or anything else. Studied it in school, but never spent time really delving into it. But
I saw that more among the men in my law school class.
yeah,
What among the women?
You know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have been maybe 2 years behind you.
She was a friend of mine.
But she would have been a contemporary of yours.
She was a friend of mine. We knew each other. We both went to Cornell.
Yes.
I wrote a piece about her for the Cornell Club in Sarasota when she died. I think she went to law school before I did.
She would have been about 2 years. Well, she's a contemporary of mine.
She's younger than I am.
yeah.
She was.
Well, she was very impressive. So are you, Sonia. So.
Not in her class, but nobody is.
Well, nobody is in her class. She's an icon, you know.
But she was also a very nice person.
She was.
She was
so
always
I understand. I never met her, but I understand she was superb as a human being.
I knew her
Aside
husband
from that,
too.
yeah, yeah. As a Jew, as a human being.
Yes.
As a woman, you know, great. So I'm going to close it if you don't mind, so we can go to services. And Sonia, once more, it is a distinct pleasure having you. And
thank you for inviting me.
And again, we will talk soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye, everyone.